Corebase is part of a generation of tools. It's really built to make cybersecurity easier. Welcome back, everyone, to the MSP Cyber Roundtable. We're here on a Friday, all dodging drones that are apparently flying overhead. I'm looking at the local newspaper. I'm in upstate New York, and people are reporting strange drones, and I'm like, is this like people are out sport flying? And no, it's a drone. I think that's what's going on. Welcome, guys. We've got Ken and Purandar here from Sotero. We've had Purandar on previously, so welcome back. Ken's new to the show.
Thank you, Matt. Great to be back.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me on.
So we're gonna later on. We're gonna be talking about this new PCI DSS update, which is PCI DSS is super interesting to me because of the evolution. It was I think the first cybersecurity standard that I was exposed to as something that I had to react to. I don't remember what year it personally impacted me, but I'm pretty sure it was close to 25 years ago. It's gone through a lot of evolution. In some ways, it's sort of like been driving at the front of the security industry as it's been moving along over the last 25 years. So that's one really interesting part about PCI DSS. And I could get more into why I think it's an interesting case, but we'll talk about that later. Ken, I am super interested. When we did our pre-call, you were talking to me about how you were really, you were on high on Mount Olympus working on PCI DSS for some portion of that 25-year period. I want to hear about that. I want to hear about how did you even end up in that place? Working on that standard with other people, and what led up to that in your career? Like, how did you get into security? Is maybe like a good place to start.
Yeah. So interestingly enough, I kind of fell into security before we called it cybersecurity. So I was in the U.S. Navy working on missile radar systems and the mainframes and computer systems that ran those big radar missile systems, and we started building networks and putting computer systems on the ships, basically PCs. Back in those days, some IBM 386s and 486s, to date myself a little bit here, and we're building those out along with the mainframes. And as people started worrying about the confidentiality, mainly at that time, of the data and making sure people weren't getting into things or putting inappropriate things on basic websites and stuff back in those days, it was called information assurance. Mm-hmm. And, lo and behold, I got blessed and nominated, just as you are the information assurance officer for the command. And, I found out I'd really liked it. I enjoyed the computer side of it. I enjoyed figuring it out. And I mean, in those early days, cybersecurity was basically antivirus and then firewalls fairly quickly right after that. But it was more, I will say, pure network segmentation and basic identity controls back then. So, got out the next 25 years doing. I've spent the next 25 years doing either infrastructure or CISO work in a variety of verticals. So I've worked in tech, I've worked in a lot of stuff. So
yeah, before we fast forward the story, I would like to talk about the Navy a little bit, and for what you can share, of course. One thing is, of course, the government's perspective or the DoD's perspective on security and it's changed over time, but it's really different than the private sector, different imperatives, I would say. And for another, really, like, it's worth noting, I was just calling out PCI DSS as like it's been impacting me personally the longest, right? But really, the U.S. Department of Defense created cybersecurity, and they didn't always call it cybersecurity, as you were saying. You had system assurance work, right? They're still using that terminology sometimes when you're looking at integrated systems. But this time you're talking about, back then it was. I mean, was it even presumed that things would be network connected at that point, or were a lot of
Not
these
really.
systems
I mean,
independent?
it was there. It was definitely there. I mean, DARPANet and all of that, ARPANET and all that had started in the DoD and DARPA, right? It was all the original networking and stuff was set up as a military communications channel. To be honest with you, it was that's what it was originally around. So it was there, but it wasn't prevalent, right? I remember the first laptop I ever saw in the 90s that had a wireless card in it that you could move around without having it plugged into a network. So
Yeah,
I remember being at an event where that was the big news is we had a wireless network now that we could move around with.
yeah, a few hundred kilobit of bandwidth.
Right. So that's the interesting thing is over my career, which is a little over, well, now I guess if you count my entire time in the Navy, I'm talking close to 40 years of time in some kind of technology now. I've got to grow up in the industry and I've got to see it change. I've got to see it morph and it's watch it accelerate. And that's been one of the interesting things, right? And you talk about PCI DSS, right? From the initial rollout of PCI DSS, which really was because credit card fraud and just the credit card companies were tired of losing money and saying, "Hey, we're gonna put the onus of this work on the people who are actually either accepting the card at the station because we went away from the old paper swipe machine, carbon copy machine to this all digital front."
Well, in the
And
90s and until very recently, right? US credit cards were super easy to clone. Actually, credit cards everywhere were super easy to clone,
yeah,
right?
well, and that's
You
what
could
there's a misnomer too when everybody thought chip and pin came out, right? They're like chip and pin's going to be the be all end all to protect credit cards. Well, no, it just keeps you from cloning an actual credit card. Does it card not present transactions, which are everything on the internet basically, which is what's called a card not present transaction? Chip and pin doesn't do anything to prevent card not
Mhm,
present action. I mean, it's completely useless. It's about credit card cloning.
mhm.
So, and you're right, the EU and stuff was much faster to adopt that than the US was. And that's another problem we see in the industry, in I will say in the transaction payments industry. And this is that balance that you have to deal with. So PCI, the thing about it is it going to make you 100% secure and you're never going to lose data? Absolutely not. Absolutely not. It's a set of guidelines. It's not even a law. It's just a guidelines that are mandated by the credit card
Well,
companies.
let's not get into the guidelines yet.
Yeah.
We're gonna get into. I want to know what's new, right? But we're also gonna talk about, like, we should probably just draw a picture of what PCI DSS is. But before we do that, um, I'm super interested to hear more stories about, how you arrived there.
Yeah,
I,
so I
I
think I think the big way, and I was going to go back and say this, how I wound up being on some of the working committees is because I was working for one of the largest, or now they are the largest credit card providers outside of the four big credit card companies.
So when you moved along from your military career,
Yeah,
and I presume you were enlisted, but
yeah,
is that not correct? Okay, so you
yep,
were
I was.
enlisted. You left your enlistment. You went into the private sector. You end up in financial services. Is that right?
Eventually,
And
I didn't
yeah,
start in financial services.
eventually landed in financial services.
Yeah,
You're in one of these big processors, and there's work on this
so
security standard.
when you're doing that at a certain level, certain role within the company, which I was running risk governance and compliance. I was over and federal government security, so I was doing a little bit of both. And we do since we were one of the or at the time we were one of the five largest. By the time I left, we were the largest. But you get invited by
Uh-huh.
the PCI Council to come put your expertise in. So you get invited to be, and they put together smaller technical committees under the larger committee, so you can work on a specific faction of PCI. So like you
Sure.
may be invited to work on the identity pieces of PCI, or the encryption pieces of PCI, or policy driven. So you get invited because they put together smaller working groups of people from major banking organizations, major fintech, and get you all together, and you try to have a conversation. You try to strike that balance on what is technically feasible, but what is also balanced to make it affordable and actually executable. And I think that's an important distinction that people have to think about on any compliance framework. You can go back to the DoD stuff that I did for a long time, working and doing DoD and other federal government work. Again, NIST framework and PCI framework, very close. They're all the same controls, right? They translate into the same controls. It just
Well, in the DoD, one of the biggest security philosophies is Bella Padula, right?
Yep.
Where you've got information that's super secret, right? And not only do you not want to allow that secret information to flow down to places where at lower security levels where it shouldn't be, but and this is an important thing people may not understand, you also don't want those secret systems even reading from lower security systems, because that provides an opportunity for someone to inject information, data, what have you, into that area that's supposed to be secure. So you end up with these really parallel or concentric rings of systems, right? That
Yeah.
they're loosely connected. And back when you started your career, I imagine network security wasn't a big deal because really the security was at the system edge. And even if you had a multi-user system, you're talking about terminals connected by cables, right? And it's really just one system.
And the truth is depending on if you're talking, I was on a ship, so we weren't connected to anything, right?
Yep.
The satellite
All
technology
totally.
wasn't there. It was all isolated on the ship itself. We use satellite for emergency burst communication. It wasn't internet connectivity. It's changed.
Right.
20 years later, you can be on a ship in the middle of the ocean and you now have internet connectivity and can be on Skype. It's kind of interesting, or whatever, Teams now, right? It was Skype when I was still in, but it was the kind of new thing coming out. But the community, and this is a great point, right? This is the evolution of things. We went from this very isolated mentality of a wall built around, and it is
Because
inside
trust.
boundaries and trust, and now it's everywhere. It's out to the edge and beyond, right? Because it moves past the edge of what you would traditionally consider an edge compute.
Yeah. So you started out in that day where we didn't trust the network, essentially. The network, where it did exist, was untrustworthy. And oftentimes it was analog, right? We didn't trust those connections that could be tapped, people talking about secrets. You would not trust those connections between systems, right? And then we created this network, and over a period of time, we started to trust this network. But now we're sort of going back the other direction, where we don't trust the network anymore, and we're replacing it with encryption technologies and other things, so that we can trust the network again. But I will get deeper into that. I'm going to do a quick in our Security Essentials series. I want to cover the basics of a CISO role, and then I want to jump right in, Ken, and have you describe at a high level. We'll talk about PCI DSS and what's new. Sound good?
Yep, sounds good.
All right. So today we're talking about the role of the information security officer, sometimes chief information security officer, or CISO, in our Security Essentials series. People define this in different ways. I want to talk about the way I think of a CISO, and I think that a lot of people imagine that this is a super technical role, and it sometimes is, but I don't think it has to be, and I don't think it cuts to the core of that role when you're lost in the technology. What an information security officer actually is it's a person that acts with power that's been delegated by your chief executive and the board to demonstrate due care to operate your information or cybersecurity program. The reason I want to describe it that way is in any country in the world that has their legal system based on English common law, which is most of the world, there's an expectation that when there's something that someone considers reasonable to do to protect yourself and others, that it would be negligent to not do those things. And cybersecurity has now reached um, um, a level of maturity and requirement that the world has collectively decided that it's a really important thing, and businesses, organizations that are larger than individuals need to care about cybersecurity, cyber risk in ways that are larger than individuals. And that power, that requirement to care, is delegated to a specific person. And if your organization has not delegated authority to act in this way, you are you are not actually fulfilling that due care obligation, which means that the chief executive or the board is negligent. But if you have taken it upon yourself to name someone to be in charge of that, then you've done your job as CEO or board to create that position. That's your exercise of due care. You care enough to assign someone the task, and you make sure that they do it. And then that person's job, and there may be more than one person. So I just want to note that, particularly in large organizations that may have multiple lines of business, may have different pieces of infrastructure, and they may have separate ISOs, and that's okay. In most organizations that we're talking about a single individual, their job is to oversee strategy, distribute resources, measure effectiveness, and to really just coordinate and manage their team. And this is the diligence part. Sometimes we talk about due care and due diligence. It's the CEO and the board's job to demonstrate due care. They care about something enough to assign someone the task to do something and to resource them effectively. But it's the CISO's job to demonstrate the due diligence that they're actually going to be doing the thing of maintaining the cybersecurity program. And everything that I mentioned is non-technical, and it's at the core of the role. And it's the reason why I think some people talk about, it's really hard to find these CISO skills, right? You don't need a technical person to do this job, right? Because anyone that cares enough, right, can oversee someone else that's technical to do these things. Now, what's typically happening in larger organizations or smaller organizations? What does that CISO role look like more specifically? The most important part of their job is that they're paying attention to the organization's risk, right? Systems needs, and they're translating those needs to those technical needs to business needs. Now, they may not understand the technology. In that case, they will actually need to work with technologists to understand or to have those technologies explain the business impact, or maybe they need to hire people who can seek out some kind of assessment, right? Assess the organization's risk, right? But then they need to take that and they need to go back to the people who are resourcing the security program, and they need to explain where's the risk, what security is in place, what's not in place, and use that in the language of compliance, because business leaders understand risk and compliance. They're dealing with it all day. All sorts of risk, compliance risk, human risk, tax risk, all sorts of things, right? In larger organizations, a dedicated CISO will typically choose vendors, implement tools, they'll create processes, they're going to oversee policy governance, working groups, they're going to meet regularly with stakeholders to make sure things happen, and really they're going to be involved day to day to manage that cybersecurity program. In smaller organizations, though, or sometimes in organizations that have just totally outsourced this part of their org, the CISO's job may be to just work with a single outsourced vendor who really manages all the cybersecurity things. And in that case, you may have delegated all the actual tasks of running the security program to an outsourced vendor, but you still have responsibilities you can't delegate away. So for one thing, you have to keep an eye on that vendor. You have to make sure that vendor is doing what they're supposed to be doing. They're suitable. But also in the case of an incident, you really can't fully delegate an incident to an outside vendor because there's impact to the internal business, and someone needs to be managing that from the inside as well. One other thing, and this is the reason why I chose this for this week, is I want to talk about, and this is really important in our partner base, the difference between an internal and external CISO. So, and this is a really interesting thing that's happened over the last couple of years. So it used to be only very large organizations had CISOs. Um, and then we started seeing a lot of recommendations and requirements that smaller organizations needed to seek out that skill set, or they needed to assign that person. There's not enough experienced security people to go around, and so the market came up with a solution, which is virtual CISO. You slice up a person, and that person can manage multiple companies, or you work with a company that maybe it's not a fractional resource, but maybe there's an outside security company that uses a whole team to simulate this CISO role. It's really interesting that, and this is the part that's super interesting to me, depending on what vertical you're in and where you are in the world, and even inside the United States, it depends on which state and which industry you're in. The rules are totally different. So oftentimes it's mandated that there's a CISO. Although it is possible for a CISO to contract out any part of their job except for the fact that someone needs to be accountable, right? Anything that CISO can do can be contracted out. Interestingly, in some industries, the regulators specifically say the CISO needs to be someone inside. You can't name someone outside the CISO. Someone outside can do the work, right? But someone inside has to be named an officer. Strangely enough, I have run across in some states, in some industries, where they recommend you have to outsource the CISO if you're a small organization that can't resource a multi-person security team, right? It's in recognition, regulators are recognizing that small organizations realistically don't have the skill sets to manage a security program, and they need to outsource this. And so it's just, the reason I'm pointing out this conflict between government regulations that say you're not allowed to outsource the CISO role and government regulations that say you have to outsource the CISO role is it's really important as a security vendor, if you're delivering cybersecurity services, that you really work to understand what are those legal mandates that affect my customer in the state they operate, in the industry that they're in, what are the rules. And I recommend that people seek their state legislated rules and regulated rules to really understand that. And it's interesting the ways it's shaking out. But basically where we're at right now, I think every organization should name an internal CISO and also have an external CISO, vCISO if they can't get that technical skill in-house. And so that you may need to have both to satisfy all the legal requirements. So with that, I'm happy to turn things over to topic of the day. Ken and Purandar, we brought you on today because in the beginning of next year, and is this January or March? I forget. The new mandate is April.
I'm March, end of March 2025.
End of March. Okay, at end of March, we're seeing a major update to PCI DSS. This is the first major update in how long?
5 years.
5 years. So a lot's happened in security world in 5 years. And there's, I imagine, many changes. But one of the most important things, and I think where we're going to spend a lot of time talking today, is there's some new changes in the encryption mandates, right? And people have changed the way over the last 5 years, right? People have changed how they're managing payment information. Many organizations have outsourced this to processors, right? And they don't have access to card information, which means that the organizations that do have card information are even more risky these days. They're riper targets. The nature of attackers, the threat space has gotten a lot more challenging. I think that there's a lot of new challenges. There's a lot of new security concepts. What's normal has changed over the last 5 years. Before we get into the changes, the overall goal here is to self-regulate, right? I think that there was some itchiness from government regulators that the industry wasn't really taking care of consumers, right? And the banking industry had the foresight to work with the processors to establish a a standard, right, that everyone could live up to. This is the banks, the processors, and the retailers. Are those the primary stakeholders in PCI DSS, Ken?
They're the primary. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I would call that your biggest chunk of them, right? There's some other smaller bits and pieces in there, but when you get into a payment loop, those are your three big ones.
And then you've got, of course, the MasterCard, Visa, the actual networks, right, that are probably stakeholders as well. Although I think these days we take for granted that the nature of those networks hasn't changed much in recent years.
Well, I mean, as far as when you talk about the rails, the rails, actually, payment rails have changed significantly in the last few years, right? So when you think of the traditional payment rails, which is what you're talking about, is the kind of the old way of doing it. Just either MasterCard, Visa, Discover, or Amex own the network, and they're the back end owner of the credit card. They're the issuer of the credit card, right? Now, big financial institutions and fintech institutions, they own their own networks as well. So they have their own payment networks. Debit card network. If you look at your debit cards, they'll have names of the networks that are associated on them. Most of those are owned by some financial institution. They're not actually owned by the big credit card companies. So it's owned by one of the big banks or one of those, Chase or JP Morgan or somebody like that maybe owns it. So there's a lot of people involved in the payment loop. I mean, ultimately, every person you add into the loop is taking a couple of cents off of what that retailer gets for his product at the end, because that's how they all make money off of this, is off this volume of transactions. So they make a penny here, a nickel here, a dime there. But ultimately, the retailer, whoever's selling the product, still winds up getting 90% plus of whatever the dollar value was that they sold the product. So we're talking massive volumes of transactions for these companies to be the billion-dollar companies that they are.
Yeah. So we'll talk about those stakeholders in a moment, and I know that they're taking a few percentage off the top to run this system, but it's worth noting, as a security professional, I'm conflicted, because on the one hand, I think, oh, this is super expensive. Why are consumers paying all this money? But actually, there's a really interesting case example of China, who came online with internal payments, and their consumer electronic transaction network launched. It was nascent 20 years ago. We had an electronic payment network for many decades, and China came along and they bootstrapped e-commerce out of nowhere. Consumers started buying stuff online, and for a period of years, a long period of very painful years, it was something like 10% fraud rate online buying stuff in China, like if you're a consumer. And so, yes, this network's expensive, but it also works. It adds predictability, right? It stabilizes the economy. It makes it so we can trust, interacting with each other.
But you are seeing new pathways, right? Think of Venmo, Cash App, PayPal.
Sure.
Those are technically new ways of paying for payments. Now, have they been, since they started it out, have been bought by bigger payments companies and processing companies? Yes, right. So that's become a thing that they're doing, right? Is that we're looking at how consumers now in this world want to be able. As a matter of fact, I think India now has its own really its own payment rail system now in the inside of India. So countries are doing their things. I think without getting in too far into the geopolitical part of it, I mean, other countries are worried about us having control, because 80% of the world's debit and credit card transactions flow through the United States.
Yep.
So other countries are starting to get concerned about all of their digital money moving mostly through the U.S. So I think we're going to continue to see this evolve, and it's going to be continuing to be a fluid environment of how payments are done over time. Hopefully, PCI, 5 years is too long for the new one to come out. It took a very long time to get this out. It realistically started a long time ago, and it didn't get ratified. And so PCI 4.0 has technically been out for 2 years. but it was in phased rollouts. The last piece of it is what's due by the end of March, and it was because of the effort it takes to implement the new controls and update your systems and make changes. And it's nothing that happens overnight. And I think people got to realize this. These are large legacy systems in a lot of ways. I know, I want to say 4.5 years ago, maybe, yeah, right around 4.5 years ago, we're looking at some statistics, and still 80 plus, or right at 80% of all transactions were still running on mainframes, not on modern cloud-based containerized modern.
At the processor level, you're saying?
At the processor and the bank level,
Yep.
even the credit card company level, it was still running on mainframe computers now. And that's another thing that people are looking at now, is how do we move off this legacy technology? Because truthfully, implementing these PCI controls, the new controls and the new way of doing things on these older systems is difficult at best, and in some cases impossible, depending on the type of system and how it's configured and stuff like that. So you wind up building fences instead of actually doing a fix.
So the last major revision was 5 years ago. 3 years, and then they started working on the new standard, and it took a couple of years to reach rollout. And 5 years is a super long time, and I really like security standards like CIS that move more quickly than that, so that they're more up to date on current technology trends. However, for a mature industry like that with a very specific infrastructure that in many cases stays in place for 10 years or more, right? I think that 5 years is actually probably as fast as it could move. I mean, there are industries like healthcare where like the last major change to HIPAA was more than 10 years ago. So
yeah,
I think,
but and I mean, I don't want to get, this is probably not the path we want to go down, but the truth is PCI and HIPAA are basically the same set of controls. We're still talking about sensitive data, and PCI and HIPAA have the same problem.
well,
data doesn't live in one spot. It gets proliferated throughout because of the way people do their job and the way people want to do their job and want to be more efficient. It's not malicious that they're doing this. It's just, I need access to this data to do, if I'm a marketing person trying to get more data on my customer base, I may have grabbed a database of our customer data and, it has all this unmasked, unencrypted customer data in it. And now I've moved it into an area that doesn't have the controls that the PCI zone would have had, and we didn't know it got moved. So this is where it becomes this constant risk assessment and constant evaluation of trying to see where that data moves around and making sure that you understand what's happening to it. And you got to have it monitored and tagged and understand how your systems tie together. And now that we're adding in APIs and moving data automatically, it can move faster than you can ever catch on to it. So you'll find it in places you never knew it would have existed.
So what are the biggest risks that you think the old standard did not effectively manage that the new standard does effectively manage? I hear you talking about inventory. I hear you talking about data inventory. I hear you talking maybe about threat modeling. What are the problems?
All those, one of the biggest changes, right, is the requirement to do a risk assessment. Mm-hmm. Right. So now you are required to do specific risk assessments
at all levels.
Yeah, at all levels. You have to do risk assessments. Now you don't have to do it for every control family, but there are specific controls within the new PCI standard that mandate you will perform a risk assessment. You will document that risk assessment, and you and your assessor, your QSA, will determine your risk level based off of that risk assessment. And if you can minimize a control, or you have to increase the control level that you're doing. So that's a big change between the old and the new. The old also wasn't very prescriptive. Like 3.2 was not very prescriptive, right? It was, and we'll talk about encryption specifically, right? This is one where they said it just had to be encrypted at rest. Well, encrypted at rest doesn't really do anything for systems that are being connected to by an application and has access to that data, whether it's encrypted or not, because it's not somebody is walking into your data center and taking a hard drive, which is what a lot of things were encrypted at rest with block level encryption. That stops me from stealing your hard drive or getting a laptop that I don't have the password to if I've got it personally in my hand. Doesn't mean I can't crack it with enough time and enough compute power and stuff like that.
Or if you're retiring a piece of hardware.
Retiring a piece of hardware protects against that. Or if I'm upgrading and returning storage devices to the manufacturer to get a credit for them, making sure that it's encrypted and just, you've got destruction standards and stuff you have to follow too. But if it's encrypted, you can kind of say, encrypted.
Let me ask a clarifying question.
Yeah.
Because I think what I'm hearing is, and correct me if I'm wrong or if I'm dated here, but I believe previously the level or number of controls that are required, the depth of security that was required around payments used to be pinned to volume. And
it still is to us. There's volume. There's also acquirer, merchant, processor.
Right. So, but what I'm hearing from you is where it used to be focused on volume primarily, now because there's a risk assessment, they're also looking at likelihood. So rather than just criticality, and that's what volume's a proxy for, right? If you've got more credit cards, there's more to lose than if you have fewer credit cards, there's less to lose, which is a proxy for like how much security maybe there should be in place. Now with recognition of the fact that actually some people can have really high volume, but because of the way they're interacting with payment card information, there's just less inherent risk. As an example, some people have outsourced all of the card data to a processor like Stripe, right? And I imagine that lowers the risk for the retailer. It may even lower the risk for the processor. And so even if you have high volume with certain architectures, less security is actually merited because the overall system is more resilient. Is that right?
Yeah, and I think what you're talking about is, to help further clarify that. So let's say I'm a retail shop and I have paid a company to put a POS system in. That POS system is essentially a black box for them. It's where the credit card gets swiped. It's where they enter their PIN number. Normally, it's inside a retail location where people see it. It's never going to be out just a standalone somewhere that everybody has free access to, right? So it's got some physical controls, light physical controls, but it's physical controls, right? Because you got people watching you shop, right? Making sure nowadays cameras watching you scan when you're self-checking yourself out, but it's still, that company would not be responsible though for the PCI on that POS system. That's going to be who sold them that POS system, and that's where it's outsourced to. It's outsourced to that processor. Just like on a website, if you've designed your application correctly and you're using an outsourced, even if you're an e-commerce seller, right, card not present, your payment page is never actually on your network. And that's a key thing inside PCI. When you read in there, it's anytime that card transaction data, if it transits your network, that means it actually exists on a segment of your network. You're responsible for controlling and having PCI on that. If you can never have that transit your network, so let's just say I'm on your website, but you're using a iframe that pops to your credit card processor. So that swipe and that data entry is never actually physically on your network segment. You're not the responsible one for PCI. The provider that you are using is responsible for PCI.
So you're outside the primary PCI scope, but I would imagine that there's still some responsibilities because
if you've got somebody who set up a fraudulent attack on you and is using you as the access point to commit fraud, you're still going to have some responsibility.
Yeah, because you might think that you've outsourced all of that payment card page stuff, but if someone hacks into your web server and changes your payment page, right? Who knows where that data is going?
Which now there are things in the new PCI that are talking about validating that the scripts are good, validating that information is a proper payment processing and that hasn't been tampered with. That's a change that was never there in the old PCI as well. So that's where I say it's getting more prescriptive but it's still a balance
Let's talk about that one. So the we had those really high profile attacks that attacked the point of sale system and the point of sale network over 10 years ago. But just in the last few years, we had some sophisticated attacks inside these payment pages. I'm thinking of the Ticketmaster incident from a couple years ago, right? Where actually it wasn't even Ticketmaster systems that were compromised, but Ticketmaster was using a third-party library, I believe.
Right.
That third-party library was compromised, and Ticketmasters thought they were all good, right? They were like, our systems are great, but this third-party library was intercepting the data, right? And it was diverting it. And I think that it sounds like we've got some changes around that too. So let's get into these new requirements. So what's new in this latest version? And let's get specific about the encryption mandates. So what do we need to be doing now that we didn't have to do before?
So I think the biggest things, right, is it now has to be, it's no longer block level encryption is no longer acceptable. It now has to be filed, field, or table database level.
By block level encryption, what you're saying is just because the hard drive's encrypted or the storage array, that's not good enough.
No,
understanding that
just keeps me from stealing the hard drive or
the physical device, but someone could still break in,
right?
Like they can break in digitally.
By
right?
the nature of that type of encryption, the application has access. The APIs have access to the data. They're already decrypting the data. They have authorized decryption to that data. So, and they're not hacking directly. Typically, they're not hacking directly into the storage device. They're hacking into the application. Coming through the application, which already has unfiltered, full view to the sensitive data. So it's a data exfiltration problem at that point, right? They're able to attack that data. So block level encryption did nothing to protect you if your application was data at rest. Encryption in that way does nothing to protect you.
Yeah. So I would imagine that this is, you said it needs to be a combination of file, field. What was the other thing you said?
A table or database, right? It depends on and this gets down to,
depends on how it's stored, right?
Well, also it depends on the software that you're using to do this because, and this is where it gets into sometimes the money you're spending and the products that you have available to you. Some things are just, you're only able to encrypt table. You may not be granular enough to get down. It could be how the data is stored too. So if I don't have a clear field that just contains credit card number, right? If I have a field that only contains the credit card number and I can encrypt only that field in a column inside a database, technically that's all I need to encrypt. But you may have it stored in multiple fields or multiple places, or it may get pulled out and put in another stack or a report or something like that. So now you've got to be able to do more encryption.
So it used to be we had to encrypt at rest and in the network, right? Yep. But now with recognition that there are other ways to get at that data, at the very least, the file or the table space needs to be encrypted.
Yeah, which says it has to be encrypted on the network and at rest. But
that's
I don't want anybody to know that went away. That's still there.
In addition to that, we also need to encrypt either the table or the table space at a minimum. And the reason for that is if an attacker breaks into the physical server where this is stored and they shine a flashlight around and they find the data, they don't even need to break into the application, right? And so encrypting the table space there ensures that from the inside of that system, the data is not easily accessible or exposed. But then there's also the risk, and this is actually the most recent Verizon breach report says that the most likely attack that you're going to see in a loss in your organization is going to involve a legitimate account, a legitimate user account, right? And that there's a real identity has been compromised, and that identity has some kind of access to the application, right? And you can use that legitimate identity access to an application to access all the data and dump it all out, even though a person wouldn't normally need to do that. And so that's where they talk about, well, maybe a field level on top of that
Yeah,
to try
I
to
mean, but
prevent.
there's also some of the other changes are the level of encryption you have to do, the management of your certificates that manage your encryption, right? That's all things that were never covered.
What are the levels of encryption? You said it's getting more prescriptive, so they're naming
Yeah,
specific.
it's got to be at least AES 256 now, right? With the right, it's basically got to be the government.
So could you do 3DES before and that was okay?
Yeah, good.
Okay.
Yeah.
And
So
now it's got to be
3DES. It was still a valid encryption under 3.2.
Yeah, so now it's got to be AES 256, which is in alignment with every other security standard, by the way. And in addition to that, what other types are?
Like I said, so management of certificate and keys, you now have to have them managed, and it has to be in an automated managed way, which was never prescribed before either.
Yeah,
so you could use a bunch of self-signed certificates internally that you had no management over at all, right? And that's always a problem with self-signed. I think people get concerned or confused a lot of times in our industry when we start talking the difference between a self-signed certificate and a managed certificate. A lot of people immediately equate managed certificates to a DigiCert or one of VeriSign or someone.
They can be, but they could be an HSM.
But typically those are your external facing certificates that you're paying for someone to manage those external facing. So internally, a lot of times you use a self-signed certificate. Well, self-signed still okay as long as they're not unmanaged self-signed certificates. Now, you could go super cheap. Well, it's still not cheap, but a lot of ways people still think of this is, oh, well, I'll just use Microsoft Certificate Authority to manage my certificates. It can be done. Is it best practices? Probably not. But you still can, but you can buy a platform to help you manage those self-signed certificates, so you know that they're the right length. You know when they expire. You know when someone has manipulated them. You know it's a valid certificate.
Just to back up, when you talk about management, you're talking about I've been saying this for like 15 years. People say, "Oh, I'm doing encryption on disk," and I'm like, "Oh, great, you're doing encryption on disk." But how are you managing your keys? Has always been my answer, because having encrypted data, right, doesn't actually make the data any safer unless you can separate the key from the data, right? And that way, if you only get access to the encrypted data and you don't have access to the key, that data is not accessible. If you still have access to the key, the encryption may as well not even be there. The whole point of encryption is to separate the key, and with recognition of that, and this is really late to the game, security standards have said you've got to start managing your keys effectively. And by management, we're just talking about, hey, there's some rules with how to manage keys,
key storage, key rotation, separation, and I'm just
and there's products. There's products that make this easier.
Here's a future emerging threat, right? Outside of PCI, just when we talk encryption, as quantum becomes more accessible, you have to have keys that are quantum resistant.
Yeah, and there's a lot of work being done there. Although, as far as I understand it, very few standards are requiring that these days.
It's still a ways out. I'm just saying, as you think through this, and if you're interested in emerging technology, emerging threat, and where the industry is going over the next 5 to 10 years, these are things you've got to be thinking about. And the reason I say you've got to be thinking about this now, it's just like PCI right now. The reason this is such a lift for a lot of companies to go to 4.0 is some of this is basic architectural changes. They have to do major architectural changes to the way they've designed their systems, their applications, their network segments, their management of this, and their identity and access platforms. So these are architectural shifts that on the surface may not sound like it's that difficult of an implementation, because you can buy a tool and do it, until you start looking at how your systems were architected and how they are connected together. And then you go, oh, I have this really heavy lift now that maybe if internally programming the way the encryption was being handled in your databases, and you're using a database that doesn't have that capability built into it naturally. So now I've got to destroy that encryption that I was using, re-implement a new encryption, so it's destructive, right? It's a re-architecture layer. I may have to recreate that data in an unencrypted, then encrypt it. So it's in it. The volume of data that you have, and depending on the systems and the bandwidth you have, that can take a long time just to do the actual encryption.
Yeah, and I this is a good segue because we've just talked about the problem space, right? And moving through that project, right? Yeah, you have to identify how are you going to encrypt the data, what tools you're going to use. But when you actually embark on that process, yes, you have to find out where your keys are going to be and buy a key management solution. And maybe it will be something cloud-based that's very low cost. Maybe it'll be something enterprise grade with an actual physical server someplace. In any case, to keep those keys safe and to keep the data safe, you have to find all the data, right? And that's actually, I think, an important. So it's a boring conversation, right? Oh, we have to find the data. It sounds like an easy thing, right? But as you noted earlier, the data is everywhere, right? And you have to guarantee that you know where all the data is, which means that you have to start doing data inventory, data management, data classification, right? And as data moves, right, you need to stay up to date on that, right? And when it moves to someplace it's not supposed to be, there needs to be an organizational response to that, because none of the fancy encryption projects, right, are going to do any good if you don't encrypt the data where it is, right? Or if the data makes its way to someplace that's not encrypted. So I think that sort of like ... like led you to your entrance into Sotero here, because that's really like the space that Purandar and his team are in. And I would love to just talk for a few minutes about that. It really is boring. Find the data, right? And track it. But like it's just as important as that key management thing, right? To keeping the data safe. And it's actually really hard to do, even though it's boring. It's a monumental task if you don't have the systems in place, right? So, Purandar, can you just walk us through, like, how are you guys dealing with these? This is a big PCI DSS challenge, but it's also beyond the payment cards industry. This data management thing is a problem in every industry, right? So, how are you helping?
Absolutely, Matt. I mean, I think between Ken and you kind of alluded to most of the components of the pieces, right? I mean, data discovery, data identification, data classification, then protection, ongoing monitoring, governance, threat protection, and things, right? And this goes beyond PCI DSS. PCI DSS is the latest regulation, or the latest set of regulations that requires this, but underpinning all of this is basic data protection or security. And that's what we started to build, and that's what we built here at Sotero. Is the other complexity that comes with this is data is not just in one form or in one place, right? You have databases, you have unstructured data stores, you have cloud data stores, you have on-premise, you have hybrid clouds. There is just a lot of data, a lot of different places that requires this level of protection. Unless it's automated, auditable, and manageable, the situation that we're in is what happens. Because as hard as companies try to do, there is always going to be a prioritization of what's the riskiest thing that we have. Let's go fix that. And as you continue to focus on that, there are other pieces, other locations of data, other applications that tend to slip through. Right. So our goal was to make this whole process easier, but extremely effective by providing a data security platform, right, that took care of all of these things for you, not just as a one-time thing, but it's an ongoing service or a platform that enabled continuous and constant data protection and capabilities. So whether you talk about databases that store PII data or PCI information, files that store PCI information, or you move this into an object store in the cloud for some kind of analysis, they have them. We can protect all of the data with one platform, and protect as in discovering it, enabling protection, enabling threat detection and prevention for attacks, as well as providing governance and audit capabilities so that companies or you can be confident that all aspects of your data are going to be compliant, but more importantly, protected as well.
So the auditability is something that you talked about really briefly, but it's really at the center here because as an engineer, you might say, well, I know that I configured this securely. I know how the data is flowing. It's all secure, right? But particularly and this is not specific to PCI DSS, but it is definitely in PCI DSS, is you have to prove it, right?
Yeah.
You have to prove it not just to people inside your organization and the people investing in the solution, but to outside assessors, to your business partners, perhaps in the case of an incident, right? You need to prove that you were doing the things you were supposed to be doing, and the problem wasn't with what you were supposed to be doing. And so, I mean, how are you supporting that aspect?
So with our platform, every action, every transaction, every bit of activity is logged, right? We're able to identify back to the source, to the target, the user, the role, what specific attributes of data they had, which application generated the thing. So the transaction in its entirety is logged, right? I mean, that, as you can imagine, when you talk about the millions or hundreds of millions of transactions, it's a lot of data. Well, we collect the data and then enable reports off of that data in our dashboard that let you pull up whether time range reports or user-based reports, application reports, or data sensitive data reports with the click of a button, so that you can demonstrate, or you can easily demonstrate, that you have control and visibility over all aspects of the data protection as well as the data interaction.
Yeah, that sounds. I mean that level of data inventory auditability is it's really important.
Yeah.
And
So let me throw in one more piece. I mean, that level of visibility is very critical as we're saying. I mean, even cyber insurance is going to require you to demonstrate that you have that. But more importantly, what we also use that information is to power our machine learning models that enable us to detect threats or deviations in behavior. That is a big part of the engine that the platform provides that enables it to detect anomalies or deviations in behavior that we can proactively stop threats.
yeah, that's both of those are super important. So on the inventory, so I'm going to tell you, I do assessments at a lot of organizations, and where I'm not doing the assessments myself, our software platform's driving a heck of a lot of assessments. And I know that generally organizations across the board are not doing the job that they need to be doing in data inventory according to the standards, according to the bars that are set out by the insurers, and they're getting claims denied on that basis. And so people need to invest there. And the other side of this that you also just mentioned was people have invested a lot in like threat detection tools on their machines, but those threat detection tools are pretty dumb, right? It's got like every threat in the world, that they're trying to compare against. And really, what the standards are saying is you should be looking at the anomalies based on what's normal for your data usage, your application. So the fact that you have the ability to have some intelligence down at the application layer that's data specific, I think is really strong around the
That's a
anomaly.
great point. I mean, threat detection,
Yeah.
most of the threat detection products rely on somebody else's research to build a library of threats, right? Whether it's signature based or something else, and say, oh, somebody's seen it before, it's been cataloged. What that misses out is activity at the data level or in your asset level, behaviors that have not been seen before, or what you were talking about earlier is the stolen credential, right?
Yeah, it's a noise problem because if you were to turn the dial up enough to catch everything, it'd be so
You won't have,
noisy it would be useless, right?
you want to have operations.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that is another requirement now too, just so to add on that. So one of the new requirements says if you identify PCI data moving out of the card data zone, it kicks off an IR. So you have to kick off an incident response plan, and you have to have a way to do that and be automatically notified of that sensitive data moving outside of a non-documented, non-allowed way for that data to move. So that was a new requirement as well. So this gets this, like I
It's
said,
sophisticated requirement, really.
it's a very sophisticated requirement, and the same with log reviews are now required to use some automated tooling for log review. It can no longer be a human that goes, oh yeah, we reviewed our logs every couple of weeks, when you know there's no way they ever looked at that volume of data, because there is so much data that comes into a SOC when they're looking at this stuff. So I think mandating that you have to have that automation built in, and when it's going to kick off an incident is critical in this environment. So,
well, thanks guys for coming in here, and I the field level or the table level encryption, the anomaly detection requirements that are new in PCI DSS are very, very challenging. As always, thanks to everyone for joining us. Do like and subscribe if you'd like to see more content. Next week, we have Ted White from Vertical Talent. He's going to be talking to us about. So I know you guys all get spammed from like recruiters all over the place. Okay, but what Ted's going to be talking to us about is what are the ingredients for success in recruiting, particularly for MSPs? Because I know, a lot of my MSP partner friends struggle with growing their teams, with recruiting the right talent. Ted's really just going to be talking to us about how do we put together that pipeline of new candidates, right, that are the right candidates, right? We don't want to just settle, right? So we're going to be talking about that next week. And until then, everyone stay safe. Thanks, guys, for joining.
Thank you, Matt. Thanks for having us.
Yep.